Hi everyone, good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar, Megillat Ruth, A Story of Survival, Love, and Politics. Tonight's webinar is hosted by JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, and is the latest installment in our webinar series which began about 2 years ago. My name is Rachel Lieberman. I'm the Assistant Director at JOFA, and I am very excited to welcome all of you tonight. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. First, there is a link to a question form in the first line of the description underneath this video. If you have any questions for our presenter, Debra Band, please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar using the form, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Deborah also encourages you to add your name to the question so she can personally address you during the Q&A session. And two, the majority of this webinar will be a slide presentation. So for optimal viewing, we encourage you to use the full screen button to expand the video to fit your screen. We hope that tonight's webinar will give you a new lens through which to view Ruth as we move into Shavuot next week. It is my pleasure to introduce and welcome tonight's presenter, my friend and colleague, Debra Band, for her second webinar with JOFA. Deborah's work in Hebrew illuminated manuscripts draws upon her love of both the manuscript arts and biblical studies. She holds a BA honors in history from Concordia University in Montreal and an MS in political science from MIT. Deborah's extensive studies of Jewish texts and research into medieval European and Middle Eastern painting and manuscripts inform her work, which includes illuminated and paper-cut books and ketubot. Her work has been featured in exhibits, private collections, community institutions, and galleries across the United States, Canada, England, and South Africa. Deborah is the artist and author of a number of books, including The Song of Songs, The Honeybee in the Garden, I Will Wake the Dawn, Illuminated Psalms, and Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth, and Hannah, on which tonight's webinar is based. Her latest book, Kabbalat Shabbat, The Grand Unification, will appear in September 2016. And with that, I turn the floor over to our presenter, Debra Band.
Lovely. Thanks, Rachel. It's wonderful to be with you all again. So we are approaching Shavuot next weekend. And apart from the evident mitzvah to indulge in the blintzes and cheesecake that we do our best to avoid much of the year, we celebrate Shavuot as the festival of first fruits, the festival of the giving, and equally important, the reception of the Torah. And in mystical terms, Shavuot is the wedding of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, and Tiferet, beauty, two of the Sefirot, or emanations or qualities of God. One of the things we look forward to, besides all the rich dairy stuff, is reading the book of Ruth. As we'll see, Ruth has the elements of all these qualities of Shavuot. Well, not the dairy stuff. The story revolves around first fruits. It happens around the time of the spring barley harvest. The eponymous heroine receives a new Israelite identity founded upon Torah. And there's even a wedding celebration at the end. Megillat Ruth, the scroll of Ruth, traces a climb from personal and national tragedy toward redemption and joy. And the depth and humanity of its three central characters and the ubiquity of their situations and values have rendered its 4 short chapters among the most beloved passages in all of biblical literature. Yet as touching and as memorable as its characters and their story are, Megillat Ruth plays an even more dramatic role in Jewish tradition, laying the groundwork for King David. Now, before immersing ourselves in the text and illuminations, let's explore the nature of the story, develop a sense of when and where in history it comes from, and get acquainted with its fascinating cast of characters and their storied lives on the land, and the lasting moral and religious values that have sprung from their lives and deeds and continue to guide our own lives. The paintings through which we'll explore this beloved story are drawn from my third book, as Rachel said, Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth and Hannah, that I published at the end of 2012. And all the themes that I discussed with you here tonight are spelled out far more completely in the book. So, and please do think of questions and let's bring them up and mail them in, and let's talk about them at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please, Rachel. Oh, where were we? Slides? There we go. Okay, so that slide is fine. Let's go to the next one. Okay, thanks. Lovely. Can we get that centered a little bit? Super. Something weird happened to the color there. Okay. So we know the story. A wealthy Judean landowner, Elimelech, and his wife, Naomi, and their two sons, Machlon and Chilion, have abandoned their homeland during a period of drought and moved southeast to the land of Moab, which is today's Jordan. Over the course of the ensuing 10 years, the three men all die. We're not told how or why. And Naomi and the sons' two wives, Ruth and Orpah, are suddenly left alone and destitute. The remainder of the book traces their struggle back to love and security. Naomi pleads with younger women to go home to their families since she has nothing to offer them, but only Orpah complies. Ruth instead famously begs her mother-in-law, entreat me not to leave you, and so on. And we'll go back to look at that in depth soon. So Naomi and Ruth journey alone back to the family home in Bethlehem. Ruth finds sustenance for the two of them by gleaning, that is, gathering grain dropped by harvesters. And by the by, she catches the eye of a wealthy kinsman of Naomi and Elimelech's. Struggling to guarantee her daughter-in-law's security and the redemption of their family lands, Naomi, one of the fascinating things that comes out in this book is the absolute central importance of proper inheritance of land. It's a major theme of this book. Anyway, Naomi engineers a particularly interesting formal introduction between her lovely and decorous daughter-in-law with the wealthy Boaz. And the story ends with the three bound to one another as a model family in love and security, not only for their own good, but for the future good of all Israel. Throughout the novella, we see several themes. The famous devotion of the two women to one another, the importance of caring for the fragile land given to Israel by God, and the implied consequences for neglecting it, and the value and importance of accepting foreigners' wholehearted conversion into Israel's religion and nation. We're going to explore all of these as they arise in my illuminations of the text. Now, I'm going to refer to the story simply as Ruth, as the book of Ruth, and Megillat Ruth. Megillah is the Hebrew term for scroll, which is how the story is read every year, literally from a handwritten parchment scroll, and it's read publicly in synagogue on the festival of Shavuot. Before we go into the paintings, let's talk for a moment about the origins of the story. Rabbinic tradition has it that Megillat Ruth was composed by the prophet Samuel, who of course identified and anointed the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. Much modern scholarship agrees pretty closely with that dating. Storytellers, however, probably transmitted the tale orally for some time before it was written down. And the text contains phrasing that Bible scholars consider to be archaic, that is, late imitations of biblical phraseology meant to make the text look more authentically biblical. Other scholars suggest that the language and political themes indicate Aramaic influence and necessarily later dating. And some suggest it was canonized as part of the political reforms under the late Judean king Jehoshaphat. And some suggest that the period of the restoration of the Jewish kingdom under Ezra and Nehemiah is more likely. Now, I find this last idea especially compelling. As you may know, in the book of Nehemiah, this governor of the people, returning to Judea after the end of the Babylonian exile, attempted to require that all Judean men who had taken non-Jewish wives while their aristocracy was in exile in Babylonia and Persia, now divorce them. The party of those men, though, fought back, and this theory has it that these men picked up and popularized this story of the righteous convert, Ruth, who not only converted to Judaism of her own accord, but even achieved the merit to become the great-grandmother of the idyllic King David. Okay, so let's say that the prophet Samuel or someone else tied to the royal court first composed the tale. When then does it happen? We're near the end of the period of the Judges, the early Iron Age, around the 12th, early 11th century BCE. Now, setting the story with the period of the Judges is really important, since that already clues us into the idea that this is a period of national chaos. There's no local central government at all, not even any strong city-states. The story doesn't even tell us which judges or chieftains ruled at the time. Now, the rabbis of the Talmud mostly agree on traditions that Deborah and her general Barak were probably the current leaders. And if you go back and read the book of Shoftim, of Judges, if you're aware of the sheer chaos and moral corruption of the era, it's just one disaster after another, you'll be alert to signs of dysfunction all around. And it's that national and moral chaos that Naomi's, Ruth's, and Boaz's brave actions will lift us out of. A fundamental assumption in the story is that the already established Jewish traditions and law offered a path to security for these women through the surrounding disorder and bad behavior. Now, I actually find it interesting to compare Megillat Ruth to a work from an era much closer to our own. That is Jane Austen's 1811 novel, Persuasion. Whereas the Dashwood women, wife and daughters of a landowner in the early 19th century England, that's so familiar to us, a model for so much of our culture, that they could be stripped of all property, all means of survival by a selfish heir and his really rotten wife, truly abandoned to the kindness of strangers. These women of ancient Israel, Israel in its earliest form with no central governance, even they had clear rights within their tribal legal codes. Next slide, please. There we go. All right. Yes, victory. Okay, were the deaths of the three husbands random? The tradition thinks not. And these quickly disposed of characters immediately reveal the dominant theme of the book: the importance of personal chesed, loving kindness, and its civic corollary, social responsibility. The very name of Naomi's husband, Elimelech, tells us that he knew that my God is king, while a midrashic interpretation asserts that the name echoes his conceit that to me shall the kingdom come. Yet this Elimelech leads his family away from the chosen land and allows his sons to marry women from their new home in Moab, one of the 7 traditional enemy nations of Israel. The tradition roundly criticizes Elimelech, a wealthy man, for abandoning his community in their time of severest need, of drought and famine. His family's misfortunes stem directly from his irresponsibility. The names of his sons, Machlon and Chilion, who are not blameless either, having married out of the nation, but the names mean sickness and perishing. Only the mother, Naomi, whose name means pleasantness, is blameless here. In the painting at the left that you can see, as I begin to tell the tale, the gray shards reveal the women's perceptions of their catastrophic loss. We see screaming men, anguished women, weapons, broken pottery, weeping wine, and flies everywhere, harbingers of death, decay, and rot. Now, I painted this scene directly from my own experience in the moments following my first husband, David's, death from cancer in the home hospice in our family room. After his last breath ceased and stopped and his pulse faded, I walked up the stairs to our living room to tell our sons, parents, and friends. And I didn't see the staircase or my paper cuts on the walls in any normal fashion. I perceived the scene as though through a broken kaleidoscope, fractured images whirling around me. It's that view of reality altered by shock and pain, and I understand adrenaline, that I've tried to convey here. Here, though, I've painted just a tiny green seedling, barely visible for all the broken hearts down in the bottom left, to allude to the fresh growth that will ultimately spring from these women's personal tragedy. Next slide, please. Getting there. Super. Okay. Naomi and her daughters-in-law, realizing that they're left with nothing in now drought-stricken Moab, set out to return to the family's ancestral lands in Judea. You can see the parched and broken earth, the heads of diseased barley and wheat. Naomi urges the girls to return to their families in Moab. She, after all, has no more sons for them, can offer them no future at all. Orpah sadly sees reason and cooperates. Now, it's worth noting here that the rabbis of the Midrash treat her viciously. Since Ruth is the heroine, her opposite number, Orpah, must be evil. And they inform us that that night Orpah was raped 100 times by Moabite soldiers, and that her great merit was to be the ancestress of Goliath, the nemesis of the young David, who, of course, is the ultimate hero of this story. Next slide, please. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Ruth, though, does not cooperate. In one of the most beloved passages in all Tanakh, all the Bible, she declares, "Entreat me not to leave you or to return from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Now, I showed Naomi collapsed on a boulder, Ruth kneeling to comfort her as she pledges her fidelity to her mother-in-law. The Midrash, the rabbinic explanations on Megillat Ruth, describe Naomi at this moment as gray and spent as the ashes of the temple grain offerings. She has absolutely nothing left to give. I actually find that bit a very, very sensitive perception by the rabbis, because it perfectly captures the way I felt shortly after my first husband had passed away. Overhead, though, in the painting, you'll see birds that symbolize the qualities that imbue Ruth, that give her the strength to encourage and accompany the drained Naomi. We see a stork overhead. Its Hebrew name, Chasidah, is composed of the same root letters that spell the Hebrew word chesed, or kindness, which is, after all, the outstanding quality in Ruth's story. The dove emerging from the palm tree, itself a symbol of righteousness in Psalm 92. The dove suggests Israel's gentleness and compliance with divine law in Jewish lore, while the red eagle feather overhead reminds us of the biblical and rabbinic comparisons of that great bird that can fight aggressors while protecting its young, to God, who brought Bnei Israel to the far shores of the Red Sea at the same time that he fought off the Egyptian pursuers. In Midrash, pink lilies that you can see on the side become a symbol of the value and sweetness of the Ten Commandments in the corrupt human world. While in a particularly funny little midrash, this is one of my favorites, feel free to ask me about it later, the caper plant is held to demonstrate the same ability to persevere through adversity as the Jewish people. Next slide, please. Perfect. Getting there? Yep, perfect. Okay. The women trudge on northwest from Moab toward Bethlehem. Now, I wanted to show them lost in the vast landscape, but what would that landscape have looked like? I had absolutely no way of knowing. It's been, 3,500 years. I ended up modeling this scene on a mid-19th century painting by the very famous British painter David Roberts. Next slide, please, Rachel. Excellent, very good. Okay, so David Roberts in his youth made a 2-year pilgrimage on foot to retrace the steps of the Bible painting all the way, and then published etchings of these things after he, in the years after he returned to Scotland, actually. Fortunately, he painted exactly the scene I needed here. Now, at this moment, it was Moab that was the rocky desert, Judea, the land of lushly ripening spring barley fields. And indeed, this scene takes place just before Passover, when the spring barley harvest occurred. The harvest, we'll see shortly, may well have been for the Omer sacrifice that's prescribed for the second day of Passover. Next slide, please. Beautiful. Great, okay. So they finally arrive at the gates of Bethlehem. And what do you think the townspeople saw? Naomi is no longer wealthy and strong, but exhausted, filthy, and bedraggled. She's been on a long, wretched journey. And what's this? She has by her side a girl from Moab, Israel's longtime enemy. Really? But even so, despite their shock and amazement, the people of Bethlehem take them in. We read between the lines and understand that the townspeople receive them kindly, if curiously, and help Ruth begin to find sustenance in her new home. Now, you might want to note the pattern that I painted into the gate of the city. This palmette pattern is based on a tiny little ivory furniture plaque in the Israel Museum. It was found in Shomron, Samaria, and is exactly contemporary with the building of Solomon's temple and palace in nearby Jerusalem. Now, palmette patterns are described in the books of Kings and Chronicles, in Malachim and Divrei Hayamim, as part of the decoration of these royal buildings. And art historians have established that patterns traveled around vast regions of the Mediterranean basin. Now, there are millions of palmette patterns from Italy around to Persia and down through North Africa. This is not the only one, but this is the one that turns up closest to Jerusalem. And I'm willing to bet that it was this pattern or something very similar to it that decorated the first temple. And so I use it all over my work for many years now to allude to the temple. And indeed, as we know, it was the events of this story that enabled the building of the temple altogether. Next slide, please. Okay. Again, reading between the lines, I think we have to understand that the Bethlehem girls tell the newcomer, Ruth, that she might glean for dropped grain in the nearby fields and thereby find a way of acquiring food for herself and her beloved mother-in-law. So she happens into the field of Naomi's wealthy cousin, Boaz, who immediately notices this lovely young woman and her unusually carefully decorous comportment. And he asks his overseer who she is. Now, the rabbis suggest that Boaz wasn't only struck by Ruth's modesty, as she gleaned not only by the reputation she had already achieved for helping her mother-in-law, but by her physical beauty itself. Next slide, please. Boaz goes up to Ruth and suggests that she should stay close to the young women of his estate rather than going to other fields to glean, and tells her that he's given instruction to his men that she should be allowed to drink from the water that they bring and eat meals with him and his harvest crew. He's already offering her the same chesed that she has offered his older kinswoman Naomi. Next, please. Good, okay. It's late afternoon, the end of a hot and exhausting day in the fields, and under the setting sun, Ruth and the other girls trudge back to town. But there's just a little frisson of excitement starting. Ruth returns to Naomi that afternoon, and Ruth's report of Boaz's interest piques Naomi's own excitement. She tells Ruth of the family relationship with Boaz and thanks God for this hint of a possible rescue from their sudden poverty. Now, at the upper right, you'll notice a water wheel. This relates to a little midrash in the micrography on the right of this page. It's all about the Wheel of Fortune. Now, in the classical era, in the pagan, Jewish, and early Christian traditions, luck was often described as a wheel. Sometimes you're up and sometimes you're down, but fate always revolved. And indeed, that's a constant theme in Kohelet and Ecclesiastes. The rabbis here, however, raise the image of a water wheel and suggest that the chesed that Ruth and Boaz displayed had the power of lifting the individual actually up and out of the seemingly inexorable cycle, and that by helping each other, they were helping themselves achieve ultimate divine favor. So I leave this page with the water wheel, the rabbi symbol of the cycle of fortune. And things seem to be looking up. Next slide, please. Ah, lovely. Okay. Naomi has instantly realized that Boaz's attention to Ruth offers a way out of their predicament. Daughter, she begins, I must seek a home for you where you may be happy. She suggests that Ruth wash and perfume herself, dress herself in her finest clothes, and present herself to Boaz that night, and that he will know what to do. Now, nowadays, Naomi's suggestion can look a little horrifying. Is she really pimping her daughter-in-law? But looking backwards at these personalities in this time, I don't think that's the case at all. First, Naomi knew Boaz's character, knew him to be a man of fine character, who had already acted to protect Ruth's safety among the rough crowd of harvesters, and also knew that he knew Ruth's relationship to his own family. She knew that he would quickly realize his responsibility to help the women redeem the family lands that Elimelech had abandoned so many years before. Second, Naomi knew that she had to find an answer to her and her daughter-in-law's rootlessness and destitution. And Ruth's beauty was the only tool in her kit. Next, please. Okay, so Ruth goes out to the threshing floor at midnight, pulls back Boaz's blanket, slips underneath, and next slide, please. Okay, Boaz startles awake and, who are you? She calms him and, whispering her identity, makes her mission clear to him. Spread your robe over your kinswoman, for you are a redeeming kinsman. Now, we see here, incidentally, a pretty reliable scene of what that threshing floor would have looked like. Biblical era threshing floors were not enclosed in barns, but were simply pounded earth out in the fields. So here we see the night sky stretching over the harvested field, jugs and piles of grains surrounding, a biblical era wooden threshing board resting on the ground. You see the pegged thing? While the oxen who tugged it around through the fresh grain are resting nearby. Since at this moment we're very close to the new moon, at the beginning of Pesach, I show the waxing, nearly full moon in the sky. And Boaz does rise to the occasion, relieved and flattered that Ruth has chosen him rather than a younger man. Midrash has it that he was in middle age and recently widowed. He indeed assumes responsibility for Ruth's future and lays out his plan to redeem the land. In the meantime, he has her rest safely beside him until first light, just before anyone else might be able to recognize her, and then return home to Naomi bearing a gift of 6 measures of freshly harvested barley. You can see them on the left-hand page. Now, it's worth noting here that this scene often evokes winks and nods. Oh yeah, that's all Ruth uncovered his feet. When you read the scene carefully, though, I think it's clear that there was no physical seduction involved. Eroticism, sexual tension for sure, but actual sex, not very likely. The first thing Boaz says is a recognition of Ruth's fine character and reputation. And this would hardly have been the case if she turned up unclothed under his blankets. Next slide, please. Okay, a little aside. I don't know how many of you saw the news tonight, but just today there was an announcement of the oldest Latin inscription found in Great Britain. Some wooden and wax writing tablets from the 1st century were unearthed in London today, and they're the oldest bits of Latin found yet in Great Britain. But I'm going to show you something older right here. Ruth returns to Naomi with the gift of barley, and the older woman realizes that Boaz has matters in hand, and she suggests that Ruth stay in that day and await Boaz's next move. Now, at the beginning of our talk, I mentioned the mystical wedding of the two Sefirot, Shekhinah and Tiferet, discussed in Kabbalah. At this moment in the story, we actually see a really interesting parallel between Ruth and Boaz and those two Sefirot. In mystical lore, Shekhinah, the feminine, lowest emanation of God, that is lowest meaning closest to the human realm, has no separate qualities of her own, but she channels all divine energy into the material world. Ruth also starts with nothing, but she receives everything and channels these riches into Israel's future. Like Tiferet, Boaz is the beauty and harmony that the divine channels into this world through Shekhinah, and he freely weds Ruth. But okay, enough mystical stuff, and back to solid material reality. Now, on these paintings, you'll see some odd alphabetic characters. So what is this? I told you I'm going to show you something old. Well, let's start with the content, though. When Boaz gives Ruth the 6 measures of barley to take back to Naomi, he uses the phrase, "Do not return to your mother-in-law empty-handed." The Midrash notices that he's using the same word, empty-handed, rekam, that God used to Moses in giving the commandments about bringing sacrifices. Since Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi were part of the landed class of illiterate society, they, or at least Boaz, would likely have been able to read for the sake of documents and trade, if for no other reason. Now we're heading into the portion of the story that depends upon Boaz's manipulation of legal forms and documents. So I thought it would be interesting to give a sense of the letter forms with which he would have been familiar. The lettering embedded in the gold borders presents the text of this midrash, comparing his use of the term empty-handed rekam to the use in Shemot. And I've shown it in a Paleo-Hebrew alphabet dating to the 12th century BCE, just around this period. Taken from the Isbet Sarka Ostracon in the Israel Museum. So this is 1,200 years yet earlier than this wonderful tablet that turned up that announced in London today. Okay, next slide, please. Getting there. Yep. Okay. And Boaz goes right to work, but he's going to do a lot more than simply redeem the women's hereditary lands. He gathers a quorum of 10 men in Jewish prayer customs. This obviously is a minyan. And this minyan is going to settle Ruth's, Naomi's, and by the by, his own futures. And again, since we're dealing with documents, I've designed these paintings as the bulle, the impressions from cylinder seals, such as would have been used to sign and seal the documents that Boaz was about to have drawn up. Next, please. Beautiful. Okay. Boaz finds the man who's first in line to redeem Elimelech's land. His name is given as Ploni Almoni, which is the ancient Hebrew equivalent for our John Doe, and informs him that redeeming the women's land also requires marrying the widowed Ruth. Now, Jewish law, we all know, does include provisions for the brother of a dead man to marry the widow to guarantee the continuation of the dead man's line and the woman's security. But legally, that's just not what's going on here. But Boaz is making this up. Ploni Almoni buys Boaz's line and refuses the redeeming them, leaving Boaz as next in line as redeemer, which is clearly what he had in mind from the beginning. Boaz has already determined to marry this elegant Moabite convert, Ruth. In the painting at right, I show a view of the beloved land that will be so redeemed. At left, a close-up of the soaring birds that symbolize the divine care that has protected Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz up to this point. The eagle, according to Midrash, the perfect protective parent in the avian kingdom, and the stork, whose Hebrew name Chasidah is founded upon the same root as the word chesed, loving kindness. Next, please. Okay. Here we see the happy family, new parents Boaz and Ruth, who, along with Naomi, the mastermind of the tale, triumphantly hold their new child high in the air, the first in the line that will, in another 2 generations, produce David, Israel's idyllic warrior and poet king. I've painted them in a walled garden, a traditional allusion to the intimacy of lovers, of the intimacy of God and Israel. Incidentally, this was the central metaphor in my Song of Songs book. And here, the family garden shelters not only the new family, but a gazelle, a pomegranate tree, a myrrh plant, lilies and roses, all midrashic symbols of the spiritual values that will inspire the family's legacy to Israel. Next slide, please. Okay. We end with tears turned to beauty and joy, a prosperous, properly inherited and cherished land resting calmly under the divine presence, nurturing all the generations leading to Boaz and his great-grandson David. I'll be happy to take questions, and let me say again that 50% of the proceeds from any copies of Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth and Hannah that you purchase between now and June 15th will go directly to benefit JOFA. You'll find the purchase link and the promo code in JOFA's message about tonight's webinar. And I'm supposed to say that if you like this, please feel free to friend me on Facebook. So, or like me anyway. So I'd love to take questions. I can't hear you.
Great, thank you very much, Deborah. So the first question we have is about the illustrations. Can you talk a little bit about how you decide when to do a full-page image versus the illuminations within the texts? Because it's clear that we have a lot of intricacies and a lot of designs in both ways.
I don't think that there's any sort of easily definable system for that. It probably has something to do with a particular dramatic scene that I want to really flesh out and get the eye to really focus on. Really, for instance, the "Entreat me not to leave you" scene. That's a key moment in the whole thing. That requires that just requires a lot more attention, and I want my readers' eyes to dwell on that. So, because there are lots of ways that I can work in all kinds of micrography and symbolism into the pages, as you've seen. So it probably has most to do with the drama.
Okay, great. Another question is, you mentioned a lot of symbolism within the different images, whether it was the flowers or the fruits or the birds. Can you talk a little bit about where you came across all of those different types of symbolisms, and if somebody was looking to learn more about that, how they would do it? Is it one text that has kind of a decoder ring in it, or is this picking up pieces throughout your learning?
Before I start a book project, I typically spend a couple of years studying the biblical text, the midrash on it. That is, the midrash, for those who aren't familiar with it, is sort of the body of analytical legends that the rabbis came up with and recorded over the course of several hundred years. Some of these things go back to the era of the Mishnah, sort of the 1st through 3rd century. Some are Talmudic, and then they were at some point gathered up and redacted, generally speaking, between the 8th and 11th centuries. So I study the text itself, I study the standard commentaries, I study the Midrash, and I study the standard academic Bible studies analyses, like Anchor Bible, for instance, which is widely available. The symbolism comes from all over the place, as well as from my own museum going. For instance, the pink lily that you saw in that it figures, it's used in a border of the Entreat Me Not to Leave You painting. The pink lily actually comes from a midrash about the importance of the value of the sweetness of the 10 Commandments in the corrupted human world, and that's actually in Vayikra Rabbah. That's in the main collection of midrash about Leviticus. There's honestly, this is sort of a depressing thing to say. This is a matter of years of study and picking this stuff up as I go. The palmette, that little palmette pattern that I said comes from Shomron, this is something that I discovered many years ago in the Israel Museum. Have it in an ancient Israel Museum catalog that's not even in print anymore, although I think it's in the more recent one, and based on the archaeology of the piece and the art historical studies and the fact that palmette designs are mentioned in the biblical descriptions of the temple, of the first temple, that's where my use of that as a symbol of the temple comes from. So stuff comes from all over the place, okay. All over the place.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have one question that asks, since we are learning this text with JOFA, a feminist organization, what feminist lessons, if any, can we learn from Ruth and Naomi?
Oh, well, this is one of the ultimate stories of women taking charge and changing the course of Jewish history. Naomi has real guts here. Ruth has real guts. They're in a very difficult situation, and they do not simply sit down and melt. They do a phenomenally difficult deed that would have been tremendously difficult for a man. And they're crossing a desert of some distance. They don't fit into the society that they're going back to. They don't fit in where they've come from anymore. They have absolutely no idea how they're going to be received, and yet, you know, they go for it. And through it all, they're exhibiting this fundamental virtue that is supposed to inspire every aspect of Jewish community, and they model it for all of us. In fact, so the Megillat Ruth is included in my book, Arise, Deborah, Ruth and Hannah, which has the 3 real women's stories of Tanakh: the Deborah story, Megillat Ruth, and then the Hannah story, Hannah being the mother of the prophet Shmuel. And in each of these cases, they're all happening at roughly the same time, certainly within the same century, within the same handful of miles. They're all happening in central Israel. And in each of the 3, it's a woman or 2 who are taking central actions that shape the future of Israel. Mm-hmm. And that's without going off into feminist theory. That's simply the bare facts.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great, thank you. So one thing that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, which I think a lot of us have heard, is that Ruth is often held up as the paradigmatic story about conversion, about joining the Jewish people. Right. Can you talk about any lessons that you may have learned throughout your research and throughout creating this narrative that you think the Jewish community can take to heart as we think about welcoming others into our communities today?
I think what this teaches us is that there are two ways of looking at conversions in our community. One of them is simply through social conservatism, that there can, how do I phrase this properly? There can be a certain degree of apprehension about the validity, about trusting converts in many circles, to whether or not they're going to be really appropriate members of the community. My synagogue, the synagogue Rachel grew up in fact, it has a great many enormously committed women who are Jews by choice. It's really quite a remarkable thing. And I admire every single one. And it hasn't been just women, it's also plenty of men. I think what the Megillah is teaching us is that we have to look at each instance very carefully. Because here, Ruth not only converts, she's not only going to lead a nice Jewish life, and the Midrash makes a great deal of the steps in her conversion, the steps in her acceptance of Torah through working with Naomi and then being with Boaz. But with all of it, she's not only a good Jew, she's so good that it's she who has the merit, who has the zchut to be the ancestor of the ideal king, who forever, our once and future king. So, she's the mother of that dynasty. So I think it's an important lesson in how you really have to judge the conversion by the seriousness and commitment of the individual person.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Dee Dee from West Hempstead, who asked, could you talk about the techniques and the media you use to illustrate the book?
Oh, sure, Dee Dee, thank you for asking that. This is, I do classical European style illuminated manuscripts. I work on cloth, on calfskin vellum, very, very high quality that I get from a sofer outside of Jerusalem. It's really lovely, lovely stuff. Just to distinguish, I say European because European manuscripts generally work on skin. Muslim manuscripts, including Jewish manuscripts done within the Muslim world, are generally done on paper, on very, very highly treated paper. But I work on calfskin. Fortunately, by the time I get the stuff, it's been well treated and sanded down and cleaned, and it's a pleasure to work on. And each sheet has its own character, its own coloration, and really its own character. And so I will choose sheets pretty carefully according to what I intend to put on them. The ink is ink. What I use is not technically the stuff that the sofer would use, but although it's usually pretty close to it. The paint is gouache, which is the fancy French term for opaque watercolor. I'm very picky about my stuff. This is not what one picks up in your local art supply store. I mean, I sort of shop the world for the stuff that I like. The gold is 22.75 karat leaf and powder. Where you see silver in my work, it's actually palladium. I've spent days and days poring over antique Persian manuscripts in the British Library, and they're full of little black streams. Those little black streams were once upon a time silver, but even closed in a book, silver tarnishes, just like the candlesticks. And so I work with palladium, which is pretty much the same color, but is inert and doesn't tarnish. I work with a lot of paper cutting. I do a lot of as you can see in this book, I do a tremendous amount of micrography, which is this is one of the things that Jewish artists actually can claim as our own invention. This is the art of making graphic designs out of lines of teeny tiny print. And I do a lot of that, usually when there's some text that I want to, some allied text that I want to bring in and sort of have its presence there, even if it isn't really terribly legible. Although you can read my micrography just with a magnifying glass. So that's pretty much it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have one question that asks, what was your favorite component of the story of Ruth to illustrate, and what was perhaps the most difficult piece for you to come up with an image for?
Oh, wow. I can't say there was one that was particularly difficult to come up with imagery for, because the story is so clear, it's so graphic. However, I think the painting that's closest to my heart, that was emotionally most difficult to deal with, was the first painting that I showed you of the scene of, Rachel, can you bring that up easily?
Yeah.
About the men's death, the very first manuscript page. This book was my recovery from my first husband's death. There we go. He had been sick with a rare spinal cord, a never before seen spinal cord cancer for 7.5 years, and his death was quite traumatic, of course, for all of us. And when I say this was based on the way I saw the world in the few minutes after his death, that's exactly the case. I mean, I saw things like the surroundings like a broken gray kaleidoscope, although I wasn't seeing pots and flies and screaming women. So this was both difficult and remains very close to my heart because it's so much of what I was feeling. The threshing floor scene was also great fun, trying to capture Boaz's abject shock at finding Ruth under his blankets. You know, that absolute horror in his face when he says, "What are you doing here?" So there was a great deal about this book that was very compelling. It's such a wonderful story, and I came to appreciate it much more for studying it in greater detail. So, anything else? I hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. So I think that is the end of the questions that we have. And I just really want to thank you, Deborah, so much for joining us, for sharing your stories with us, and really allowing us to better understand how we can learn about Megillat Ruth. And I hope that everyone will be taking lessons from tonight's presentation with you as you go to shul for Shavuot, as you go to your Tikkun Leil Shavuot. If you are still scrambling for a last-minute presentation, I hope that you'll consider taking something that you've learned from us tonight. And I also really want to emphasize that while we tried our best to show the illuminations during this presentation, we have done an enormous disservice to them and to Deborah, and I would highly encourage everyone to consider purchasing copies of the books. We'll be sending out discount codes for purchasing the book with the follow-up email to this webinar. And I would encourage you, if you enjoyed this webinar, to follow Deborah on Facebook, to follow JOFA on Facebook, to join us on social media, and to join our email list. And we hope to be offering many more opportunities like this webinar and other in-person events in the coming months, and we hope that you will be joining us for those as well. So thank you, everyone, for sharing your evening with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
And Chag Sameach.
And Chag Sameach. Enjoy the rest of your evening.